The claim that Jesus spent his missing years in India originated with Nicolas Notovitch's The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ in 1894. In 1887 a Russian war correspondent, Nicolas Notovitch, visited India, and proceeding into Tibet, at the Lamasery or convent of Hymas, learn of the life of Saint Issa, best of the sons of men. He claimed he had found documents in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery which describe Jesus' life. In these scrolls Jesus was known as Saint Issa. Notovitch's account of his discovery of the work is that having been laid up by accident with a broken leg at the convent of Hymas, he prevailed upon the chief lama, who had told him of the existence of the work, to read to him, through an interpreter, the somewhat detached verses of the Tibetan version of the life of Issa, which was said to have been translated from the Pali. Notovitch says that he himself afterward grouped the verses in accordance with the requirements of the narrative. The divine youth, at 13, rather than take a wife, leaves his home to wander with a caravan of merchants to India Sind, to study the laws of the great Buddhas. He was welcomed by the outcasts for his wisdom and miracles, but the Brahman priests grew jealous and sent Saint Issa away. He journeyed to Kashmir and Tibet. In Tibet he mastered the Buddhist scriptures and then returned to Palestine to preach. At 29 Issa returns to his own country, and begins to preach. He visits Jerusalem, where Pilate is apprehensive about him. The Jewish leaders however find no fault in him, and he continues his work for 3 years, closely watched by Pilate's spies. He is finally arrested and put to death, not by Jewish influence, but through the hostility of Pilate. His followers were persecuted, but his disciples carried his message out over the world. Problem number 1. This kind of travel would have been extremely difficult for a youngster. The distances that had to be covered were incredible for anyone in that time, adult or child, given the methods of transportation. Let's not forget the incredible expenses a trip like that would incur. Problem number 2. The testimony of Notovitch is considered first. Notovitch acknowledges that he could produce no manuscript evidence for the purported translation he published. He acknowledges that he did have a camera with him when he visited Hymas. Although he never specifically says that he took pictures of the Issa manuscripts, he mentions in passing that a hired hand accidentally exposed film taken on the trip. Problem number 3. Notovitch describes Luke as saying that Jesus was in the desert until the day of his showing unto Israel. This, Notovitch says, conclusively proves that no one knew where the young man had gone, to so suddenly reappear 16 years later. But it is not of Jesus, but of John that Luke says this in verse 3:2, so that it will hardly yield the conclusive proof Notovitch seeks. At this point in Luke's narrative, in fact, Jesus has not yet appeared. Problem number 4. Notovitch's testimony, that the ancient record had been written from eyewitness testimony only 3 to 4 years after Issa's execution, and that the disciples had already set out to evangelize the world. Even without allowing time for the eyewitnesses to travel from Palestine back to India, this chronology conflicts with New Testament chronology. Interesting occurrence. The Russian Jew, Notovitch's story makes the Romans solely responsible for Jesus' execution, while the Jewish religious leaders strongly approve of his teaching and character. Problem number 5. According to Notovitch, Jesus mastered Buddhism whilst living in Tibet. The big problem with this is the fact that Buddhism did not reach Tibet until the 7th century AD. Buddhist author Christmas Humphrey states in his book Buddhism Penguin 1962. Before the 7th century the sole religion of Tibet was the Bon. Sometime in the 5th century AD a number of Buddhist books were brought into Tibet from India, but they seem to have been ignored, and it was not until the reign of King Srongtsen Gampo in the middle of the 7th century, that Buddhism became a force in Tibet. Pages 190 through 191. In The Elements of Buddhism, John Snelling, himself a committed Buddhist, notes, "We can trace 2 principal transmissions of Buddhism to Tibet, an initial one begun during the 7th century CE and a second one starting around the year 1000. Pages 33 to 34. So the evidence shows that Jesus could hardly have been a student of Buddhism in Tibet in the 1st century AD. What must also be noted is that what Saint Isa teaches bears almost no resemblance to Buddhist teachings. Problem number 6. In October 1894, the unknown life attracted the attention of the preeminent Orientalist Max Muller of Oxford University, who himself was an advocate of Eastern philosophy, and therefore could not be accused of having a Christian bias, who pointed out that the life of Isa did not appear in the catalogue of the Tandjur and the Kanjur, their great collections of Tibetan literature. If we understand M. Notovitch rightly, says Professor Max Muller, this life of Christ was taken down from the mouths of some Jewish merchants, who came to India immediately after the crucifixion. He goes on to ask how these Jewish merchants happened, among the uncounted millions of India, to meet the very people who had known Isa as a casual student of Sanskrit and Pali in India. And still more, how those who had known Isa as a simple student in India, saw at once that he was the same person who had been put to death under Pontius Pilate. He goes on to suggest that the Buddhist monks may have deceived Notovitch. Two things in their account are impossible, or next to impossible. The first, that the Jews from Palestine, who came to India in about 35 AD should have met the very people who had known Isa when he was a student at Benares. The second, that this Sutra of Isa, composed in the 1st century of our era, should not have found a place either in the Kanjur or in the Tandjur. If the monks did not indulge in duping Notovitch, nothing remained, Max Muller said, but to accuse M. Notovitch of a disgraceful fraud. And as he was writing his article, there came to him from an Englishwoman visiting Tibet a letter that pointed strongly in the latter direction. It was dated Le Ladakh, June 29, 1894, and read in part: Yesterday we were at the Great Hymas Monastery, the largest Buddhist monastery up here, 800 lamas. Did you hear of a Russian, who could not gain admittance to the monastery in any way, but at last broke his leg outside and was taken in? His object was to copy a Buddhist life of Christ which is there. He says he got it, and has published it since in French. There is not a single word of truth in the whole story. There has been no Russian here. No one has been taken into the seminary for the past 50 years with a broken leg. There is no life of Christ there at all. Problem number 7. In 1895 Professor J. Archibald Douglas, a professor at Government College in Agra, India, took a 3-month vacation from the college and retraced Notovitch's steps at the Hymas Monastery. He published an account of his journey in the 19th century June 1895, the book of which reproduced an interview with the chief lama of the monastery. He was at that time a guest in the Hymas Monastery, enjoying the hospitality of that very chief lama, who was supposed to have imparted the unknown life to Notovitch. Professor Douglas found the animal life in the Sindh Valley much less picturesque than Notovitch had described. The following is the interview